Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about the collective unconscious or dream interpretation. It was about women who possess what he called differentiated spiritual intelligence, and why this rare psychological type either destroys them or transforms them into something humanity desperately needs but rarely recognizes. In his clinical practice from 1907 through the 1950s, Jung documented a specific subset of female patients who exhibited what he termed superior feeling function, combined with transcendent intuition. These weren't merely sensitive women or spiritual seekers. They were something far more extraordinary and unsettling. These individuals possessed psychological abilities that had evolved beyond normal human consciousness. They could read the energetic signatures of souls like others read books. They decoded the hidden symbolic language that governs existence itself. Most controversially, they moved between material and spiritual worlds with an accuracy that defied explanation. Jung called this discovery dangerous because these women consistently ended up isolated, misunderstood, and psychologically fragmented. Not because they were mentally ill, but because seeing everything others miss came with a cost that neither they nor society understood. Today, I'll reveal Jung's most dangerous discovery about women who see the invisible, and why he believed this rare psychological type represents both humanity's greatest evolutionary potential and its most vulnerable members. The case that revealed Jung's most dangerous discovery began in 1909 with a patient he described in his private correspondence as the woman who dreams in symbols. She had come to him not for mental illness, but for what she described as living in two worlds simultaneously, a condition that left her exhausted, isolated, and unable to function in ordinary social reality. Jung wrote in his unpublished notes, "This patient demonstrates a psychological phenomenon I have never encountered in such pure form. She possesses what appears to be direct access to archetypal content, yet maintains rational function. Her dreams predict future events with disturbing accuracy. Her mere presence catalyzes psychological transformation in others. She suffers not from pathology, but from an overdevelopment of psychic function. This woman could walk into any room and immediately sense the unspoken tensions, hidden griefs, and unconscious dynamics that others remained completely unaware of. Every day, she noticed meaningful coincidences that helped guide her choices with remarkable accuracy. Her dreams contained symbols that later manifested in waking life with such frequency that Jung began documenting them as evidence of what he would later call differentiated spiritual intelligence. But Jung realized he wasn't treating a disorder. He was observing what happens when consciousness evolves too far ahead of society. Spiritual intelligence can develop to such an extent that it becomes socially dangerous. He documented her describing her experience. "I see what others cannot see, feel what others cannot feel, know what others do not know. This is not a gift. This is a curse that separates me from human connection while simultaneously making me responsible for truths no one wants to hear." This wasn't delusion or grandiosity. Jung's careful verification revealed that her perceptions proved accurate with statistical impossibility. She was demonstrating consciousness so advanced it had become psychologically isolating. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Because this patient's spiritual intelligence seemed to operate through mechanisms that conventional psychology couldn't explain, Jung began researching something he named autonomous spiritual complexes. These were mental structures that operated independently to handle spiritual information without involving regular conscious awareness. Jung wrote in his Red Book period notes, "Certain women possess what I can only describe as inherited spiritual technology. Their psychic apparatus has been refined through generations of trauma, mystical experience, and evolutionary pressure to perceive what collective consciousness is not yet ready to integrate." Modern neuroscience research by Dr. Judith Orloff on highly sensitive persons and Dr. Carolyn Miss on intuitive anatomy validates Jung's early observations. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology. He found women with what he called differentiated spiritual intelligence. These women comprise less than 1% of the female population. They don't just sense energy, but decode the fundamental patterns that structure reality itself. Jung observed that these women possessed what he termed multi-dimensional perception. Their consciousness worked across both material and spiritual planes at the same time. They processed physical sensory data like everyone else. But they also processed archetypal, energetic, and symbolic information that others couldn't access. They functioned as living bridges between visible and invisible dimensions of existence. Jung wrote, "The danger lies not in their spiritual perception itself, but in the psychological isolation it creates. When one perceives the invisible architecture of reality, while others see only surface appearances, one becomes a translator for languages that society refuses to learn." This creates what Jung called the problem of the transcendent function. When your greatest spiritual gift becomes your greatest psychological burden, because it separates you from ordinary human connection. But Jung discovered the real danger wasn't the perception itself, because women with differentiated spiritual intelligence see others' unconscious spiritual contents clearly. Therefore, they become targets for what Jung extensively documented as spiritual shadow projection. This is where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting spiritual truths they're not ready to acknowledge. Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, "The individual who perceives spiritual reality clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which ordinary consciousness depends. When someone sees through the illusions that keep people spiritually unconscious, they become a mirror that society cannot bear to look into." Jung documented this pattern repeatedly. The spiritually intelligent woman gets blamed for being too intense, too deep, or making people uncomfortable. When she gently suggests that someone examine their spiritual disconnection, they explode at her for being judgmental. When she expresses concern about obvious spiritual bypassing, she's accused of being negative or destructive. Jung realized this wasn't a coincidence. It was collective defense against spiritual evolution. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote, "Everything that challenges our spiritual complacency appears dangerous to the ego. But it is easier to attack the person reflecting our spiritual poverty than to examine what is being reflected." This creates what Jung called the spiritual scapegoat phenomenon. Women with differentiated spiritual intelligence often become the designated problem in every spiritual community they enter. Not because they cause problems, but because they reveal spiritual inauthenticity that already exists in collective spiritual bypassing. Jung observed, "The bearer of authentic spiritual intelligence becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about its own spiritual immaturity." This pattern explains why these women don't just feel misunderstood spiritually. They feel systematically persecuted by forces they can't rationally explain. Jung's most disturbing discovery was yet to come. He noticed that differentiated spiritual intelligence showed up differently in different women. He identified 6 distinct patterns within this rare type. Each pattern represented a different way of processing invisible spiritual information. Type 1, the energetic empath. Jung documented women who possessed what he called differentiated feeling function combined with spiritual sensitivity. These women go beyond just sensing emotions. They perceive the complete energetic signature of souls. They can see past trauma, spiritual gifts, and evolutionary potential. According to Jung, the energetic empath experiences others' spiritual states as if they were her own physical sensations. She feels the collective spiritual hunger, the widespread soul loss, the epidemic of meaning crisis that most people suppress beneath busyness and distraction. These women function as spiritual barometers for collective consciousness. They sense when someone is spiritually disconnected before that person recognizes it themselves. They feel the approaching spiritual crises in relationships, communities, and cultures months before they manifest. Jung discovered that their nervous systems have been calibrated through generations of spiritual sensitivity to detect frequencies of authenticity and pretense that operate below ordinary awareness. Type 2. The archetypal translator. Jung identified women who maintained open channels to what he called the collective, unconscious spiritual wisdom. These women regularly receive guidance through dreams, meaningful coincidences, and intuitive insights. As a result, their lives unfold like mythic stories. Jung found that they serve as bridges between the spiritual realm and practical reality. They translate the abstract language of the soul into wisdom people can act on. These women dream in symbols that predict spiritual turning points. They experience meaningful coincidences that guide major life decisions. They receive insights about humanity's spiritual evolution through direct, intuitive understanding. Their consciousness operates as a bridge between what is spiritually true and what is spiritually possible. Type 3. The sacred solitary. Jung documented women who required long periods of spiritual withdrawal. This helped them process the overwhelming amount of invisible information they constantly received. He called this sacred solitude. It was isolation chosen not from hatred of people, but from spiritual necessity. Jung understood that these women grasp something that extroverted spiritual cultures resist. The deepest spiritual transformations happen in silence, away from the opinions and energies of others. Their solitude becomes like spiritual laboratory work. During withdrawal periods, they process collective spiritual material. They receive insights about human evolution and integrate spiritual understanding that later helps heal others. When they withdraw, they're not escaping spirituality. They're diving deeper into spiritual dimensions that require complete energetic protection to access safely. Type 4. The alchemical transformer. Jung identified women who possessed what he called the transcendent function for spiritual transformation. These women don't simply survive spiritual crises, they convert spiritual suffering into collective wisdom. Jung recognized that they embody the wounded healer archetype in its purest spiritual expression. Their capacity to transform spiritual pain into spiritual medicine serves the collective spiritual evolution process. These women willingly enter spiritual dark nights of the soul. They confront collective spiritual shadows that others avoid and emerge with spiritual treasures. These treasures can only be discovered in the depths of spiritual crisis. Their integrated spiritual wholeness becomes a beacon for others still fragmented by unresolved spiritual wounding. Type 5. The presence healer. Jung documented women who communicated spiritual truth through the quality of their being rather than through words. He called this therapeutic spiritual presence. Jung realized that these women understand that spiritual healing happens through energetic transmission rather than verbal instruction. Their very existence becomes proof that spiritual transformation is possible. Their presence operates on frequencies that bypass mental resistance and speak directly to the soul. Simply being near them reminds others of their own spiritual potential. They've learned that the deepest spiritual service is often to witness another's spiritual process without trying to fix, change, or improve it. Type 6. The synchronicity magnet. Jung identified women whose consciousness naturally attracted meaningful spiritual encounters and sacred experiences. He called this phenomenon spiritual synchronicity attraction. Jung discovered that their psyches operate like tuning forks for spiritual frequency, drawing to themselves the people, situations, and opportunities that serve both their spiritual evolution and their service to collective spiritual awakening. These women don't seek spiritual experiences. Spiritual experiences seek them. Their lives become textbooks of divine timing. They're filled with encounters orchestrated by invisible spiritual intelligence. What others search for desperately through spiritual practices, they receive as natural gifts through authentic spiritual alignment. Understanding your specific type is crucial. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous. Jung observed the devastating effects of unintegrated spiritual intelligence on these women. Therefore, he concluded that seeing invisible spiritual reality without proper psychological integration posed genuine dangers. These dangers affected both individual and collective spiritual development. Jung identified 3 specific spiritual dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1. Collective spiritual disruption. According to Jung, the woman who perceives authentic spiritual reality threatens the collective spiritual agreements upon which religious and spiritual communities depend. When someone sees through shared spiritual illusions, they become a destabilizing force in spiritual communities. These illusions include unspoken agreements to avoid examining spiritual bypassing, guru projection, or religious conditioning. Jung understood that spiritual organizations, families, and communities function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what spiritual truths will and won't be acknowledged. The spiritually intelligent woman inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Danger 2. Spiritual isolation. Jung documented how differentiated spiritual intelligence creates what he called the problem of the superior spiritual function. This happens when your greatest spiritual gift becomes the source of your greatest suffering. As Jung explained, the curse of spiritual consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The woman becomes an island of spiritual awareness in an ocean of spiritual unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These women often report feeling like they're living in a different spiritual reality from everyone around them. Danger 3. Spiritual identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that women who absorb collective spiritual material often lose contact with their own authentic spiritual identity. They become so flooded with others' spiritual projections and expectations that they can't distinguish between their genuine spiritual calling and what they're absorbing from spiritual communities. Jung called this spiritual participation mystique. This is a state where spiritual boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective spiritual expectations rather than their authentic spiritual path. Jung warned that the danger is not merely spiritual exile, but spiritual annihilation, the complete loss of individual spiritual identity in favor of collective spiritual possession. This is why Jung considered the integration of differentiated spiritual intelligence not just therapeutically important, but spiritually urgent. Because unintegrated spiritual intelligence posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the spiritual individuation process. This was a systematic approach to maintaining individual spiritual identity while serving collective spiritual evolution. Phase 1. Spiritual discernment and boundary development. Jung taught spiritually intelligent women to first distinguish between their authentic spiritual experiences and what they were absorbing from collective spiritual projections. According to Jung, the first spiritual task is to establish what belongs to your authentic spiritual path and what belongs to others' spiritual expectations. Without this discrimination, there can be no genuine spiritual development. Jung instructed patients to maintain daily periods of spiritual solitude. This allowed absorbed spiritual material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic spiritual voice. Phase 2. Spiritual shadow integration. Jung discovered that women who see others' spiritual shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own spiritual shadow. The more they deny their own capacity for spiritual bypassing, ego inflation, or spiritual materialism, the more disturbed they become by recognizing these patterns in spiritual communities. Jung understood that every spiritual quality that irritates you in others exists within your own spiritual shadow. Only by integrating your own spiritual darkness can you perceive others' spiritual darkness without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious spiritual service. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in collective spiritual evolution. This is the ability to serve others' spiritual development without being overwhelmed by their spiritual projections or losing your individual spiritual identity. As Jung explained, the spiritually individuated woman serves as a bridge between authentic spiritual reality and collective spiritual potential, helping others access genuine spiritual experience without sacrificing her own spiritual integrity. This requires developing what Jung termed spiritual containers. This is the ability to temporarily support others through spiritual crises, while remembering that their spiritual journey is not your responsibility. Jung's ultimate discovery was powerful. He found that differentiated spiritual intelligence, when properly integrated, transforms from dangerous isolation. It becomes what humanity needs most: authentic spiritual guidance that serves collective consciousness evolution without spiritual bypassing or false transcendence. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The spiritually intelligent woman who learns conscious integration becomes exactly what collective spiritual evolution requires, a bridge between what is spiritually true and what is spiritually possible." Remember Jung's patient from 1909? After 4 years of working with Jung's spiritual individuation process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between her authentic spiritual experiences and absorbed collective spiritual material. She found her calling as a spiritual guide whose differentiated perception helped others navigate their own spiritual crises. She built relationships with people who valued her spiritual insights rather than projecting their spiritual expectations onto her. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her spiritual intelligence as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a gift requiring conscious spiritual development. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to see less spiritually, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived spiritually. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming. This represents Jung's most dangerous discovery, that some women are born with spiritual consciousness that exceeds collective readiness. And this advanced spiritual perception will either destroy them through spiritual isolation and overwhelm, or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its spiritual evolution. Your differentiated spiritual intelligence isn't a malfunction in your spiritual development. It's an advanced feature of consciousness evolution. You're not broken because you see spiritual truths others miss. You're spiritually ahead of your time. The question isn't whether you should suppress your spiritual perception to fit into conventional spiritual communities. The question is whether you'll develop the spiritual individuation skills necessary to integrate your spiritual intelligence consciously. Jung's spiritual individuation method offers a path from dangerous spiritual isolation to conscious spiritual service, from overwhelming spiritual perception to integrated spiritual wisdom, from spiritual curse to evolutionary spiritual contribution. You were born to see the invisible, not to suffer in spiritual silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your spiritual insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom, and discernment that transform dangerous spiritual perception into collective spiritual medicine. Your spiritual gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your spiritual gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed spiritually intelligent women were meant to be. Spiritual consciousness pioneers preparing humanity for spiritual development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't that some women see the invisible. It's that most women who see the invisible never learn to use what they see spiritually wisely. The danger isn't in the spiritual perception itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary spiritual abilities. You are not too spiritually intense for this world. You are exactly what spiritual evolution requires. Once you learn to wield your spiritual perception as consciously as Jung learned to wield his. The danger of seeing the invisible isn't that you perceive too much spiritually. It's that you might never learn to see with the spiritual integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the spiritually intelligent woman, you're part of a rare psychological type that Jung believed essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which type of differentiated spiritual perceiver you are. Your spiritual individuation journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about spiritual development that transcends collective spiritual limitations. The conversation continues, the journey deepens, and the spiritual healing spreads through every woman brave enough to claim her place in this ancient lineage of spiritual knowing.